afternoon, students. Today we will start with the revision of Unit 2, and we are going to discuss about Indian Renaissance, and I'm going to give you an introduction. Students, Indian Renaissance that we talk about is a term that was coined for the social religious reform movements that happened during the 19th and the 20th century. And today we will be discussing how this concept of Indian Renaissance came into being, and we will be discussing about the introduction of Indian Renaissance ideology. So first and foremost, what is the meaning of the term Renaissance? Renaissance is a term that actually it literally means a new beginning, and it was used for the first time for 15th, 16th century Europe. I think I need to give you a background into European history. So European history has ancient, Middle Ages, and then the modern time period, or modern Europe that we call about. Now, it is considered that it was the time period of Renaissance that broke the backwardness of the Middle Ages, and that's when a new beginning happened for Europe. It marks the starting of Europe turning into a modern, turning towards modernity. Now, this new beginning, or the term Renaissance, has a lot of literature that came up during this time period, a lot of art and architecture. So you have St. Sistine Chapel, and you have the new ideas of painting that came into being. Here now the concept moved from God to human being. Now human became the subject of most of the literature that is coming up during this time period. Prior to this, during Middle Ages in Europe, religion became the most important concept and most important ideology, and from Renaissance it was the human psyche, human ideology, human as the center figure of any society. So now we were talking about how human development can lead to development of society rather than religious development. Religion is a part, but first and foremost, human as an individual has to be in the center. After Renaissance, we have the Reformation, where religion was being challenged, and we find the growth of Protestantism and growth of after that we have Enlightenment thinkers coming up. So this is how Europe then started talking about rationality. It started talking about human agency as a very important or the central focus for development. It was not a religion. It was not God's will to have any sort of miracle. Rather, it is human as an agency, the hard work of human, the curiosity of human that has led to development of new technologies, new ideas, and new beginnings. So thus, Renaissance defines a term when human beings became given more weightage over religion. Now, what do we then understand by Indian Renaissance? It is beginning of new thoughts, where human and life became more important than religion. It started in the 19th century when we came in close contact with the British world, with the European political and social ideologies. That's when we started thinking about human Indian. We started talking about Indian as Indian individuals, as what are we really lacking about? What is that Indians are lacking about and the Europeans are not? And that marks the beginning of a new thought that developed in the minds of Indian intellectuals, that what is it? Where are we lacking? Are we lacking somewhere? Because Britishers and English East India Company, and then the Britishers always argued that Indians are not rational. So what is it that we are not rational about? This rationality, European rationality, then gave us an enlightenment or a sort of vision that our indigenous belief have turned into superstitious indigenous belief. These beliefs are not something that we can talk about or we can justify. It's just that we have been rampantly following it. Just somebody else must have told us to follow certain beliefs, and we are following it. Same goes with caste system. People have just started following it. Okay, back in those days, the idea was that it was for division of labor. But then division of labor just on the basis of birth into a family cannot be justified. I could be born as a Shudra, but I am a very intellectual person. I have a habit of reading just because I have great love for reading scriptures. Why cannot I do that? Just because I'm born into a caste? I am a born Kshatriya, but I don't like violence. I just don't like violence. Probably I like, say, I want to become an artisan. I want to create pots and pans. Why couldn't I do it? Just because I'm born into a caste? This is superstition. This is how things are being carried forward for time. This division we have created. Nobody else has created it. It started to be for division of work, but then it became an identity marker. So this is how we started talking about Indian Renaissance. Now, Indian Renaissance is divided into two movements. It's called Reformist movement and Revivalist movement. The intellectuals of the 18th and the 19th century, when we have the coming of English East India Company and how English East India Company within some time became the rulers of most of the subcontinent, that's when certain intellectuals sat beside and decided that what was it that made them different from us? Is there something that is different in their society and in our society which is at tangent with each other? That's when you have two group of movements that came into being. One was reformist and one was revivalist. Now, reformist movements, they wanted to reform the Indian society. Now, they have identified certain aspects of Indian society which needs to go away, which shows backwardness. What were those? We will study n number of evil practices. We have discussed few of them. We've discussed about how sati pratha, child marriage, caste system, idol worship, all these things were something that reformists were saying has to go away. This is not something that can continue in a rational, forward-looking society. So all these evil practices have to go away. Then what were the reformists doing? They were attacking orthodox and superstitious beliefs and practices. All the reformist movement would be talking about removal of superstitious belief, that every act should be justified through rationality. So if you are, say, not consuming non-veg on Monday, there should be a justification, a just idea of why everybody should not eat non-veg, consume non-veg on Monday, on Tuesday, on any day. If you if a cat has crossed your path, you should not cross. If the cat has passed the road, you cannot cross it. Why? What is the justification? And if there is no justification, that superstitious belief does not have any sort of place in the ideology and should completely be proved. The other thing that most of the reformists would be talking about would be rationality and education. They are saying that for any individual to be rational, education is the most important thing. So education is something that every Indian should have so that they become rational. Now students, when we talk about education, the indigenous education system, if you follow the Gurukul system only catered to two upper caste only. So Brahmins and Kshatriyas could only be part of the Gurukul system. The Vaishyas, the peasants and the artisans were rather taught by their own ancestors about the profession that they're doing. And Shudras were doing menial jobs, so they were completely kept away from education system. Formal sort of education was only and only for upper caste. So what most of the reformists are talking about is that education should be given to all, because that is going to make them rational, and as soon as a person is irrational, they're going to remove any sort of orthodox and superstitious beliefs. They're going to reform the society, reform themselves, reform their family, reform the society. And thus India is then going to turn, Indian society is then going to be turned into a reformed, rationalized society, which Europeans are. And look where they are, what they're doing. They are becoming such great traders, such big powers, just because every act that they're doing, there is no religious connotation attached to it. There is a justification for it. Why did they came to India? They wanted to trade. Nothing else. They wanted to trade, make money. That was their ideology. And that is how every Indian should also talk about. Help of British government in bringing laws to remove evil practices. All the reformist leaders that we will then discuss would take help of the British government to remove evil practices, because they now understand that law enforcements have to be taking some very strong measures to remove these evil practices. And thus British government were the champions of were ruling us, so they took help of British government in removing and making out a very decisive decisions in removing evil practices from Indian society, be it abolition of sati, be it child marriage. We soon had age of consent bill being passed. Then we also had further we will find that we have certain reforms movement in which widow remarriage was agreed upon, and this is how so on and so forth, that we have all the reformist leaders or reformist intellectuals taking help of British government in removing these social evil practices from our Indian society. Next, we have revivalist movement. These are reformist movement. They want to reform the society. Now, there are revivalist movements. Now, in the revivalist movement, the idea was reviving the society. Now, most of the revivalists were saying that there are all rationality is there in Hinduism, specifically in Hinduism. Sorry, all the rationality is there. It's just that we have stopped reading the scriptures, the Indian scriptures. We are so dependent on Brahmins who themselves have no idea what is written in the scriptures, that we have lagged behind. So what actual thoughts that all the revivalist leaders are then going back to our scriptures. So if you have Arya Samaj, they're saying going back to the Vedas. If you have Theosophical Society, they're asking you to read Upanishads and Vedas. If you have Ramakrishnan, he's saying let's study Vedantic philosophy. We have to study all these things. So these are the revivalist movement in which they are saying that Indian society is a very progressive society. All the knowledge of the world is there in the Vedas and Upanishads. So if you ever want to be rational rather than looking towards Europe, we have to look within our own literature, and soon we will find that that literature has given us the knowledge of the world. And what are those scriptures? Vedas and Upanishads. So this is how you're reviving the ideology of reading. Now, very different from reformists, they are saying that Western education is good, but Indian education, there should be a balance between Western and Indian education. And that is going to make Indian society a very rational society. So that's why the term Hinduism as a universal and rational is what most of the revivalist intellectuals would be talking about. So they differentiate between what is called as Hindu. So they agree that Hinduism is different from Hindutva or the Brahmanical caste hierarchy that is being followed. Hinduism is a very universal and a very rational ideology, and thus for them, Hinduism is a very universal and a very rational ideology, and it has space for a very widespread audience, and thus most of the revivalists are then talking about a universal brotherhood which can be catered to Hinduism, because the truth of this entire universe is something that Hinduism has in itself. It's just that we have stopped reading it. Spreading the message of Indian scriptures, and revivalists would continuously talk about reading the scriptures on your own, not looking into any sort of interpretation by anything. And thus we will find most of the revivalist intellectuals were then translating and then interpreting, translating the Vedas and Upanishad in the colloquial languages, in the regional languages for people to read. Because earlier, as we discussed, all the scriptures were written in Sanskrit, and Sanskrit was not something that everybody could read. So that's when we have massive printing of translated versions of Vedas and Upanishads for people to read on their own and understand what is the exact ideology of Vedas and Upanishads rather than getting dependent on Brahmins. So next, we are going to discuss the impact of Indian Renaissance. It led to social reforms. It led to beginning of several social reform movement. We will discuss that in length, certain social reform movement. Further, it was in the Hindu community, in Hindu society. Looking at Hindu society, we find that the Muslim society also kick-started certain social reform movements, which ultimately led to foundation of some very great institutions in the country, which then became the champion of Western education. Again, the impact of Indian Renaissance and the revivalist and reformist movement was Western education. This led to spread of Western education in India when it was decided that if we ever want to compete with the British citizens or with the European world, education is something that is fundamental for us. So thus we have spreading of Western education, opening up of schools, colleges all across the country where Indians were being trained into Western education. It also led to the beginning of self-introspection. Now, most of the time we have studied the Orientalism by David Syed, and we have discussed about how Britishers gave us the identity of how we are, what we are and what they are not. So we became weak, we became barbaric, we became irrational because they were rational, they were civilized, they were white. So this was the time when we started looking for ourselves, that are we those what they are telling us, or if we are not, then how can we revive ourselves? So that led to when you will find that post establishment of Indian National Congress, which also agreed with most of the ideology of British. We have the extremists saying that no, Indians are also have the courage, have the power, have the right knowledge to fight back, and that further led to paved way for independence movement, a national identity formation, because now when we were othered is when we started creating an identity for ourselves, a unified identity. We became so if the Britishers were the rulers, so we became the subject. We together then created an identity of foreigners versus Indian, and that led to creation of a national identity. How did it come up? When we had those social reform movement, when we had spread of education, when we had the concept of sitting back and realizing that our religion or our scriptures are also talking about things that Europe is talking about, then why are we so different from them? Had we made ourselves so vulnerable? Yes, we have. How can we overcome it? Through a movement, through a unified movement, and that led to our independence struggle. I hope students you will continue studying these, and soon we are going to have a live session, and I hope that you have some pertinent questions that you would like to discuss. Thank you, students.